All right, we are recording. Hello, everybody. Welcome to a discussion of The Darkness That Comes Before by R. Scott Bakker. This is the first book in the Prince of Nothing trilogy, also the first book in the Second Apocalypse series. So I am so looking forward to this discussion. We have like myself, a couple guests here who have only read the first book in this series, The Darkness That Comes Before. And one of them is Joanna, and the other is Raf. And absolutely check out their channels. Joanna's channel is Joanna, and Raf's channel is Raf Blutaxt. So check that out. And we also have here a veteran, an apologist, if you will. That's fair. Yes, an apologist for the series. This is the Second Apocalypse, and
an apocalyptic apologist.
Yeah. He is, of course, the one and only Jimmy from the Fantasy Network. So, hello, my guests. How are you all?
Wonderful.
Doing great.
Good.
Being angry, which is, I guess, great for me.
Well, this is going to be really interesting because, guys, cheers, Raf.
Cheers.
I just ate Indian food like way too much, and I am so bloated right now. Like, I can't breathe.
All right, I'm getting my drink.
I mean, it's 7 p.m. for me, so I have the right to drink, I feel.
Yes, you do. It's perfectly fine. Even if you were here, it's 1, so good enough.
Very good.
So, cheers then.
Cheers.
All right, now, so we're going to begin this with a non-spoiler general assessment of the book, and in the case of Jimmy, he might even non-spoilerly explain why he loves the series to everybody. And then we're going to get Joanna's thoughts, general thoughts, and Raf's general thoughts, non-spoiler. And then when we're done with that, we're going to go right into the spoilers, discussing the characters and the scenes and whatever else comes up. But big time spoilers in this discussion. So we will warn everyone, though, before we begin with the spoilers. So I think it's only fair to let Jimmy begin, because he's probably bursting at the seams to tell us why this is such a cool, awesome series and why he loves it so much. So Jimmy, you want to go ahead and lead us off?
Yeah, sure. I just finished the entire series recently. I read Prince of Nothing last year, then jumped in the Aspect Emperor. And as soon as I got in the Aspect Emperor, I was like, why did I wait? I don't know why I waited to do this. I love it so much. And I don't know what it is so much, but I just know the fact that every time I end up reading this series, and right now I'm kind of working my way back through very slowly, it's just one of those series that like clicks with me. I don't necessarily know if it's perfect. I also don't know if I agree with everything that is in these books, but without a doubt always captivates me. And I like the range that it has. It starts out very, very slow, but within these words that kind of get painted out through the pages and through these books, there's dragons, there's sorcerers, there's fire, there's apocalypse, there's all these things. And along with that is this almost archaic way of writing, and it being told as a history of what is to come as a holy war. And I don't know, there's something about it that feels like very monumental, and it has a gravity to it that like pulls me in. And I actually feel the stakes at this world. I also really enjoy that this series is pretty uncompromising with a lot of its inspection of humanity. And again, even if I may not agree with the critiques of men that are given in these books, I think it's something that's worth at least talking about, debating about, and inspecting. And this is a series where I am easily the least smart person on this panel when it comes to formal education, when it comes to knowing history and philosophy and literature. But this series has pushed me to read up on things that have nothing to do with fantasy, have nothing to do with fiction. The bicameral mind comes to example, right? That's something that I wanted to study after learning about this. So it just pushed me to broaden my horizons, whether that be in agreement or whether that be in debate with the author and their intent, or what I perceive as their intent. And to me, that is well worth my time. It's extraordinarily engaging. And also there is just some wild stuff that happens in these books, like very entertaining, that I haven't seen in other series. And that's a little bit harder to see from book 1. Obviously I have full context, so that I'm a bit biased, but I don't know. I love it. And it's very methodical. And I like methodically written slow fantasy because I'm boring. So
Well, you weren't boring just now.
No.
And I heartily appreciate that explanation. That is, I think, a very good job of explaining the value. And even I've seen it in just the very first book. And so I imagine that having read the series, you have even more context on that. So fantastic. So Joanna, what did you think of this first book, The Darkness That Comes Before? What are your general non-spoiler impressions?
So I was a bit nervous to get into this book and to get into this series initially, because I had heard that there is quite the patriarchy in this world and brutality towards women. So I was nervous about getting into that. I think what made me curious and want to get into this series is that Jimmy actually really was a huge push for me because of the way that he described Bakker's prose and the philosophy that I heard that's introduced in it, the complexity. And I like books that challenge me, I think. So even if it's like Jimmy said, even if I don't agree with everything I'm being challenged with, I think there's some value in sort of getting my own ideas and thoughts challenged and weighed in some way. And I think Bakker, I think Jimmy actually said it best about the way Bakker just draws you in with his writing. That was what I think sold me on this book and why I loved it as much as I did. And it's a really tricky book to say that, because I feel very careful praising this book, because I don't think this is going to be what people go into fantasy wanting or expecting in some ways. I think a lot of people go into fantasy wanting to feel uplifted, wanting the hero's journey, wanting to feel an escape from the hardship of reality. And maybe they want hardship in their fantasy, but they still want to land in a place of hope. And I don't think that this is quite that series. I didn't go in expecting that. But I did, I had a huge admiration for the way that Bakker writes. I think he's able to write this sort of historical context to this world in a way that makes the world feel very real to me. I feel like I'm reading almost the history of a real world. And at the same time, when the fantasy elements come in, it's just all the more cool and fascinating the way that all works together. And I loved the character psychology and the themes explored. And so it kept me turning the page. It kept me wanting to pick up the book again, despite it being so dark and uncomfortable at times. So overall, I had a great experience with the book, though it wasn't exactly a comfortable read. I'll just put it that way.
Right. Yeah. Well said. I think I had similar reactions to you, Joanna. So I'll elaborate a little bit later, but I want to hear what Raf has to think. I'm actually especially curious, Raf, because of your background in philosophy. And given that R. Scott Bakker I don't know if he finished his PhD or
as far as I know, he has not finished it. So
okay.
He's basically at the same level as me.
So there you go. Perfect. So the two of you are ABD, philosophy.
I'm very much not AB in that D. I'm very much at the beginning of it all. But yeah, so I was very nervous to read this book as well, because a lot of people were telling me, it's like, you got to read this. There's all this philosophy in there. It's so smart and so dark. And I'm like, I'll probably think it's very banal, and then everyone will think I'm a snob. And and turns out, yeah, sort of, maybe. See, I enjoyed reading it. It was okay. I do like Bakker's writing style. He uses a lot of, fancy sounding words, so I can read this and feel smart for understanding and knowing the words and stuff. That was fun. I did feel like the plot is pretty solid. I mean, it is basically, following certain historical events in a way. I don't want to, go too deeply into that now, because I think it's more like for a spoiler part of this discussion. I'm fine with that. I did have issues with most of the characters, and I do have fundamental issues with the world building, where I think Bakker does some stuff that needs to be questioned. So, but overall, I enjoyed reading it. I'm looking forward to reading the next 2 books at least. And it's definitely not the darkest thing I've read in fantasy, and it's also not the worst, or worse when it comes to grim and dark. I don't want to call it grim dark, edgy fantasy. There's stuff out there that is doing these things far worse than Bakker is doing them. So that's sort of my verdict here. It's a solid book.
Okay, great. So a little bit of skepticism I hear there, Raf. So that's good. That makes the panel more interesting for sure. And I released my own non-spoiler review, so maybe some folks have seen that, but just to sum up, essentially, like I said, I feel similar, I think, to Joanna at this point, and I admire so much about R. Scott Bakker's writing. I think he's a really fantastic writer. In fact, I'm shocked at how engaged I was while reading this, considering how much exposition there is in there. He does stuff you're not supposed to do these days as a fantasy writer, and he gets away with it because he's just that good. And his exposition isn't ever, it's not fluff. It's not awkwardly or clumsily inserted world building or anything like that. It's just he's got some stuff he wants us to think about in the course of this. And so I like that. I felt engaged while I was reading. My primary worry, if I can put it that way, maybe that's not quite the right word, and I think that the philosophy I think he is sort of exploring in here is perfectly legitimate. And at many times in my life, I just
disagree with his ideas.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, I think he's exploring something that is worth exploring. And I am not sure that I want to, like Joanna, I don't want to necessarily land there. But the idea, I think what he's really showing us in here, and this is not spoilery, I think, but the idea that we simply don't have free will. We are victims of the universe. We are little tiny, mites here that are essentially what's going to happen in our lives is pretty much predestined, not because of any entity up there that's guiding our lives, but just because the universe works according to certain laws, and there's evolution, and there's just human nature. And it's a little bit like, Joanna, you have read the book as well, Behave by Robert Sapolsky.
I told you, Jimmy.
Joanna said you would mention it. I bought it.
Yep.
I told him, I said, I promise you, Philip is going to bring up Behave in this discussion. I promise.
I owe Joanna.
You guys know me too well. But it is very much in that vein of, but get to the end of Behave, and you're just like, I think so. I don't want to mischaracterize Sapolsky's book, but it was just like he left a tiny bit of room, maybe for doubt that maybe we do have a tiny wee bit of free will somewhere that we can't quite explain away. But largely feeling like, oh my God, I'm just so predictable, and I'm so much, my life is going to follow, for the most part, these tracks that have been predetermined for me by things that are much bigger than I am.
Of what came before.
Exactly. Right? And what came before, that's all the stuff that came before. And someone who is extremely observant would be able to basically predict your behavior, knowing what came before. So we'll get into that in a more spoilery way, I'm sure. So that philosophy, I think, is legitimate, some territory to explore. I think that the idea is, there's probably a fair amount of evidence, although I don't think you can conclusively say
there's not as much evidence as certain neuroscientists and certain, philosophers that are very enamored with that part of, say, materialism and determinism will make you believe. That's the big problem.
All right, good. We'll get into that, because I do feel on some level that as much as I have some inner sympathy for that view of the universe, I feel like it's a bit of a surrender, and I would prefer to think, or maybe I'll just delude myself. I'll knowingly delude myself and think that what I do matters, and that through sheer determination and courage, I can make a difference in my life and in the world and craft meaning out of all of this. And I'm not sure that Bakker or even Sapolsky would ever say, no, you can't craft meaning, in this universe that is essentially very deterministic. So I just said, I think I just let loose a big cannonball. So then I think Jimmy is looking like he wants to respond to this. So,
well, some would say that the meaning is part of survival. I've seen people argue that. And also there's the simple matter of like, why would you act any different? Like
right.
if you are in and I'm not saying this is how I feel, but a hallucination of consciousness, right, of this reality, then why would you act any different according to it? You're immersed in it every single day. I've seen people also mention that, which I think is a pretty interesting way of thinking about it. It's like, because I consider myself to be pretty nihilistic. Like I think I'm just here for like, hopefully 70 years. 70 would be immaculate for me and the things that I've done to my body. But hey, if I make it to 70 and I feel like that's it. And I get a lot of people who are like, well, then like, why do you get out of bed? And I'm like, why wouldn't I? You know what I mean? Like you can still experience things, the experience of in the moment of whether or not I'm genetically predispositioned or whatever to do anything, whether it's determined or not, it doesn't really matter to me because I'm still experiencing it. It still gives me, releases in my brain and sensations and everything else. So I've always considered myself to be somewhat of an active nihilist, I guess. Like I still go.
There's a big problem with the way people like that approach it, people like Bakker approach it here, and that is that it's about like biological, genetic, those kind of predispositions and stuff like that. And it's very easy to focus on that and say, yeah, look, it's all in your genes and your brain. And that
have you read this
absolves you from all the shit that society does to you, which is probably has a much bigger impact on like how we all react. Way more of that is determined by our circumstances where we live and all of that stuff. But if you focus so hard on the biology, you can use that to not do anything about like those circumstances and change those circumstances that you can actually change. And I think that's the danger to fall into with this.
That is something I did appreciate about Sapolsky's Behave, just bringing it back to that book, because it did look at behavior, not just from a biological standpoint, but also from a cultural, from an evolutionary, from all different types of standpoints. And so sort of synthesizing that idea, but it is interesting. So Jimmy is the one who pointed out to me that this book starts with that Nietzsche quote, which I actually missed. I started the book and didn't even realize that I skipped the Nietzsche quote at the beginning. Did you notice?
How could you? It's a Nietzsche quote.
Just to
I
give
just
that
skipped
some
opening page
context,
when I opened my book.
I'll read the quote,
read it.
then you can explain it, Joanna. I shall never tire of underlining a concise little fact, which these superstitious people are loath to admit, namely, that a thought comes when it wants, not when I want.
Yeah. So, there's a lot to unpack just in that.
How much free will there?
Yeah. Like how much choice do we have over the thoughts that arise in our minds, and where do they arise from? And I think that that's something that Bakker might be exploring.
Another book, if you want to feel a sense of a lack of agency and free will, is Richard Dawkins' The Selfish Gene, which is more
probably
actually
the best thing he's ever done.
More purely scientific. And even then, though, I think there is a whole chapter on compassion in that book. So I think that's a book that does somewhat get mischaracterized a little bit sometimes, but nevertheless, it is similar to the Sapolsky book, where you end up feeling like, oh, wow, there's just so much in me that's much bigger than I am, and I'm just really along for this ride here, being dragged along by these forces, whether they be biological or social or other, that are just much bigger than I am.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's a problem. I mean, quoting Nietzsche is always fun. Nietzsche's probably the most misunderstood philosopher out there because he's so eminently quotable.
Yeah.
And you could just like throw out a Nietzsche quote and everyone will make of it whatever they want. Which is why Nietzsche is mostly quoted by edgy teenagers and edgy atheists who, and anyone in between just ignores Nietzsche and thinks he's crap, or they are actually serious philosophers who know what they're doing. I'm not quite sure if I think Bakker is in that last category here. It's like it makes a lot of sense what he's looking at, but you can go with that in all kinds of ways, because when Nietzsche says like you have no actual control over your thoughts in that reality in that regard. And that goes kind of towards the, say, the doxastic voluntarism. And there's a wonderful idea there that goes back into like religion, for example, which is like, can I make myself believe something and then be, you know, judged for that morally? That kind of goes back to someone called Clifford and the wonderful like ship question. There's like a moral it's a thought experiment, really. It's like a ship owner has like a ship and he sends that, you know, over from England to the US. It's a story from like the 19th century. And he kind of knows that he needs to repair the boat, the ship, because it's getting old and whatnot. But he doesn't want to spend the money, and he manages to fully convince himself that the boat is still safe for one more trip. And then the boat sinks and everyone dies. So is the owner actually to blame or not? And that's like the question, like, could he actually fully convince himself to believe? Because if he, you know, fully believes that this is the facts, then you can't actually fault him for that. And that's the question that is very difficult to answer, because we don't know whether that is possible or not. And the answer usually is that no, we can't actually make ourselves fully believe that a certain thing. Yeah, it's kind of difficult to go there.
Well, at least he didn't start a holy war.
Well, I mean, but to be fair, the people that start the holy war pretty much know what they're doing. From where I'm standing, that's part of the problem with the setup.
Yeah. All right, great. Jimmy, you want to respond to that? And then I think
I just want to add one quick thing. So the quote at the beginning of the book and the entire trilogy is centered around the idea of doubt. And I've actually seen Bakker in comments before refute a bit of the determinism and say it's not as black and white as some would make this series out to be. But if you think about it from the quote in really this first trilogy specifically, from a sense of doubt, I think it gives a wider lens to some of the stuff that happens in the book, rather than it just being, hey, this is determinism on page, look at me, blah, right? It's a little, it's something a little deeper than that, or maybe wider.
Raf would be able to answer this better than I would, but I started to look up more Nietzsche, and I did study some Nietzsche a long time ago. So, I mean, I know he's often associated with determinism, and determinism is broadly thought of as, you know, there is no agency, there's, you know, no free will. But I think from what I heard, or from what I understood looking up more about Nietzsche, it wasn't quite that. That's like a misunderstanding.
Definitely.
Yeah.
Simplification.
I mean, the interesting thing with this book is that even if apparently everyone is very much determined, and our main character, and we're coming to spoilers here, our sort of main character, Kelhus.
Oh yeah, okay, spoilers, everyone.
So that starts very early on. Like, if Kelhus is able to read everyone's facial expressions because he's so, you know, he's basically an Ubermensch, to put it mildly, beyond good and evil, and to stay in that Nietzschean thing. But the point is, our Kelhus is whatever, however you would say that, are his actions also predetermined?
Absolutely.
And that's the question.
He thinks he's obeying a summons by his father.
Yeah, but
so
that's a good question to ask.
But that's the point. Like, could he just say, you know, give his father the finger and just go somewhere and raise cattle? Possibly he could. And that's the question, because he's aware of what he does.
Yeah.
And if you're aware of what you're doing, if you're aware of the reasons why you are doing something, that does ideally give you the chance to say no. And even if that one no that you can do, that one act that is there, is obviously to, you know, deny everything and commit suicide, that is an option there. Once you're aware of all the reasons, once you've lifted the darkness that comes before and are aware of what comes before. And that's a question that is definitely, I hope it will be answered or looked at in later books, because
I'm hoping so too.
We don't get any of that in this book. But that's I think the point is, like, Kelhus treats everyone else like they are completely predetermined automatons that he can just read and direct and push the buttons. But he can do that because he knows extra facts. So the question is, does he have free will?
It's a good
Right.
question. Great question.
To go back to Bakker too for a moment, I've looked at a couple of his interviews, and it's very clear to me that he also is not. One thing he is very much clear about is that certainty is something that he is very wary of, and very much against. So the idea, and Raf, you want to move your camera back a little bit the other way, because you just went off screen a little bit there. There we go. Perfect.
Other
Oh
way.
no, you went back
Nope,
this
wrong
way.
way. Back again.
Yes,
Boom. There we go.
Wait
There
a
we
second. It's the cable that is dragging the camera, I think.
Oh, okay.
You're perfect right there.
Now you're centered.
There,
Perfect.
yes.
Yes. All right. So we have an author who very publicly has said, certainty is something I'm very much against. And you see it, and we are full on in spoilers, folks, for The Darkness That Comes Before. The idea of a holy war being a very fine example of people acting in certainty, right? The idea that our religion is correct, this religion is evil and wrong because it's not ours, and therefore we have the right to go in and invade this place. And that's at the heart of this. I also think an exploration of the idea of certainty.
And I would argue that's like the greatest failing of the first novel is exactly right there. Because Bakker, as one of our, very secular thinkers of the modern day, is completely incapable of actually describing religious fervor. It doesn't happen in this book. We have a holy war. It gets announced by the Pope equivalent, whose name I have already forgotten because who cares? And everyone just marches, and everyone just marches. Methanet, whatever, that guy. Mathanet, yeah. So he says like, hey, let's do an holy war, and everyone, and then you have like mass panic, and everyone runs to pseudo-Byzantium, and the first rabble marches on to get slaughtered, and the other guys hang around until the end of the novel. But we never get any proper reason. It's just like holy war is declared, and everyone just goes there. He does never in the entire novel get us like the inside perspective of a true believer. There's, whatever, Prince Proyas, whatever that
Proyas
guy.
is the closest.
Proyas.
Yeah.
He's the closest, but whenever he's acting religious, we get that from someone else's perspective.
So you guys
never get it from the inside.
Joanna or Jimmy, any thoughts on the lack of true representation of religious zealotry in here?
There's probably truth to that. I guess we don't see some of the followers. I guess my understanding is this promise of this holy land called Shima. That's my idea of what they're going for, and what that promise is or portends, I feel was still left a little mysterious to me. Jimmy?
You will. That's all I can really say. And I could elaborate on certain characters and things, but to be honest with you, at least one of the perspectives, I can't remember if it begins in this trilogy or not, and I don't want to say it, which isn't a cop-out, I swear. But yeah, it does. It very much, you will see people doing heinous things for their beliefs. That definitely happens.
That's
the point.
If we do have, though, I think Raf is onto something, because you do have characters. Proyas, like you said, is the closest that we get to someone who's a true believer, but every other character is a cynic, I think, or is in some way or shape or form broken. And
Proyas is not. Right.
Proyas is a true believer.
Yeah, Proyas is definitely a true believer.
But sure. I think he also is. He's a very sophisticated character too. There's some self-awareness on his part, which is not what you usually think of when you think of a religious zealot. I think Proyas is somehow a little more self-aware, probably because of his relationship with Acamian. I think he's had some education, and which he resists, and he almost detests at times. As you can see it in the way he treats Acamian.
But I think that's part of the problem, right? This whole thing is modeled after the First Crusade, right? And obviously, don't get me wrong, the First Crusade was a terrible thing that happened. It's brutal, and there's all kinds of things we can say about it. But because we look back at it from a very secular perspective, we find it very difficult to believe that people in that time took part out of a sincere belief that was not just like rabid religious zealotry
Mm.
or cynicism. And I think that's something that a lot of contemporary authors fail to take into account. Even Stephen Erickson in The Malazan Book of the Fallen does not actually get there. Sincere religious faith is very difficult to portray. And I found it astonishing for a book that is very much about a holy war, that we have like no sincere believers.
Yeah.
Anyway,
Well, what about, actually, there might be one.
Imral, maybe the guy that gets
Well,
killed.
I was going to say, actually, perhaps Inrao, who
Mhm.
does die, although
Mhm.
he has plenty of doubts at the same time.
But
But I
doubt
was
is
going to say
fine when you're
maybe,
religious.
true,
Doubt is
it's
fine.
actually, it's healthy, actually.
Mm.
Nair is somebody who doesn't seem to question his own beliefs ever. So
Yeah.
I want to get Joanna or Jimmy to weigh in on this. Is Nair a kind of zealot in a sense, although he's in opposition? He's not part of this holy war.
Well,
He's not
but-
part of this holy war, but he's very much, well, he is broken as well, isn't he? Because of what's
Very
happened. But he seems to be very invested in his way of seeing the world, which is now obviously counter to what a lot of the other characters are. But he seems very rigid, and the type who's not going to indulge in doubt very much, even if he is broken, even if he does feel like he's at a point where all that's left to him is vengeance against Kelhus's father. So I don't know. What do you two think of that?
I think partially he kind of feels like a rebellious figure in the idea of his tribe, right? Like, or I should say in possession of his tribe, because in some ways, he's the weeper. So he actually, even though he seems to fall back on that rigid structure of the beliefs of his tribe in times of conflict, we do see him have internal thoughts questioning what one might call toxic masculinity, possibly. So I actually don't know. I think he might be a cynic as well in regards to what his people do and what his people believe in the culture that they're from. I think it's a little bit independent of the holy war that is in the book.
You would compare him then to, like, say, Karsa from the Malazan series.
Oh yeah, for sure. I mean, I also think Khal Drogo from A Song of Ice and Fire, but I think a lot more nuanced than someone like Khal Drogo for sure. I think Karsa might be a better suited example.
I mean, Khal Drogo doesn't get that much time to actually develop as a character.
Poor guy.
Mm.
Yeah,
that poor sap.
Spoiler for A Song of Ice and Fire.
I weep for him, but only when my tribesmen can't see me.
Yeah, they're weepers.
So Joanna, what do you think about all this? Is there any character in here that you feel like embodies religious zealotry or certainty? Or are they all kind of modern, broken, cynical, jaded people in one way or another?
That's the thing that's so mysterious, is that everybody's following this Maithanet, and we don't even know who this Maithanet person is. We don't really get insight into him. And I think that's a good point. I think that, Raf, you're right. That is probably something that could have been explored more in this book, and maybe I think that's a valid criticism. I think something I always try to do or try to imagine is, when I'm reading a book like this, is I try to imagine living in a time period like that. And I feel like, because what Raf said about how it's easy for us to look back at these, even the First Crusade or things like that, with a secular perspective, but just trying to make meaning out of your life when civilization is so awful. And I don't know, I can only imagine what it would mean to have religion as hope, or have some kind of hope, when you see so much poverty and horror all around you. Just to have something to believe in, because it's terrible. And the way that the people are living, it sounds awful.
But I think that's still like the secular perspective, because especially Christianity is sort of like the idea of religion as solace. But to go back to Richard Dawkins, whom I really despise, but he said something very important somewhere in there before he got really terrible, and that is that before Charles Darwin and the idea of evolutionary theory, Christianity, or like any form of theism, like the idea that there is some sort of creator who created the world with a plan, was the best explanation. And we tend to forget that because we have these options. But when you read philosophical texts from like even like the late 18th century, someone like David Hume, he points out in his Dialogues on Natural Religion, which is a fantastic text, he has someone say like, yeah, but maybe all of this happened just through random iterations and suddenly it all worked and that's why we ended up here. It's basically the idea of evolution, sort of. But you know, Hume just puts this forth as a thought experiment, and everyone else is just laughing at that one character. It's like it's written like Socratic dialogue, and everyone is just laughing at him. He's like, yeah, I know it's ridiculous, but isn't that an option of how it all could have happened? And I think that's something that we tend to forget. It's like up to a specific point, religion is not necessarily just solace. It is also that, but it is very much the only way to see the world. If you have time to question, it's like, why am I here? The answer will be because some creator of whatever gender, in whatever version, some creating force has put me here. And we don't have that question anymore, because if we ask ourselves, why are we here? We have the options. We can go the religious route. We can go the scientific route. We can go the who fucking cares route if we want to. But that choice is not there for characters in a pre-scientific world.
That's what I was trying to say. I don't know if I said it well, but I think, I mean, that's kind of my point, is when you're living in that kind of world, what else do you have to look towards? And at the same time, I also think, and I don't know if I read this right, but I mean, the way that I was interpreting it is that possibly, and Jimmy can let me know, I was also thinking that possibly that was some kind of magical thing too, because there is magic in this world. So I don't know if sorcery has any effect on the belief systems of the people, and especially about Maithanet, and if he has some sort of magical ability that is drawing people to him. So that was also, I think, in the back of my mind when I was reading it.
I think it's heavily hinted that he has, and that is a problem. And he's possibly evil,
because he
and part of the unholy consult.
He sees Achamian. He knows Achamian is a sorcerer.
Exactly.
Oh, that's true.
Only one can know another one, right?
Right.
If that is the case, I'll be very, very pissed.
Ah.
For other reasons.
Well, you asked Joanna, you asked a very important question, I think, which is what else can we hope for? And the answer, I think, a lot of times in situations like this is a savior, a hero, right? And you also mentioned earlier that this is not a narrative that gives you the typical hero's journey type thing here. You have several characters. Confucius, for example, very cynically is exploiting the idea of being the hero, the savior. You have Kelhus, who certainly, if you were to ask, Serway, he's the savior, right? But he scares the pants off of me because of how manipulative he is. I don't see him as a good, person who's come to deliver the world from its pain. I see him as someone who is perhaps
beyond good and evil,
a bit more savvy than most of us, and it seems willing to exploit that, at least at the moment. Maybe he's going to develop. I see, basically exploitation of the hero narrative, and nothing that makes me think that we're going to get anything typical fantasy here at all, right?
Yeah, just based on like what I'm hearing, I think you guys will be pleasantly surprised. I think you'll be pleasantly surprised.
Interesting.
One of the things that I will say is that, we're talking about doubt, right? And we're seeing cynicism here in book one. Bakker takes a really long time on things. So the argument for doubt will not show itself immediately. So in the context of book one, there's not a lot of that there, but it's something that builds. And I don't like, in some ways, the Holy War is a distraction from like more, I guess. Like it's about a Holy War, but it's not.
There's a big, like one thing Bakker does really well is he gives you that sense of thousands of years of history before this. And what Achamian's group of mages are on the lookout for is the what are they called? The
mandate schoolmen.
The mandate schoolmen are on the lookout for these
For the unholy consult.
The
to come
unholy
back and
consult.
do-
right? So that's a much bigger picture thing that's looming behind this holy war, which is, I think, presented in a very cynical manner, right? Like you have the emperor dingling trying to exploit it for his own ends very selfishly, and then the other nobles trying to fight against that.
I
et cetera, et
think,
cetera.
yeah, I'm sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you, but
Oh, go ahead.
I think what Raf said's totally correct in the fact that like it's not a great inspection of that fever, like complete devotion, right, to this belief in this thing. And I think that's where like maybe some commentary on today is actually brought into this. So even though obviously it's based on the crusade, like there's a lot of inspiration here, there's still like some room in there for more secular commentary. And what if real belief came back? Like what if there was a belief in something? I think that's kind of where it goes in a way, without saying anything spoilery, but I don't know that for facts, but that's just kind of how I took it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I'm looking forward to finding out. One thing that you just said, and I think it's important to look at with the characters, Philip, is you said there's no classic hero's journey,
Right.
like Joanna said. The interesting thing is, most of the viewpoint characters we have here are pretty old. They're very much adults. They are not young heroes. When you look at it, it's like Esmenet is older, Akamian is definitely older. However you pronounce our noble savage, that guy's definitely older. Nair. Like the audiobook says Naur, but you know,
maybe it's Naur, I don't know.
That guy. Yeah, they're all older guys. Possibly you know, maybe Kelhus and Survey.
Survey's young. Survey's I think like 20.
Yeah, but even she has, you know, she's also already, she's gone through some stuff. She's born children, and none of those are your naive farm boys getting picked up by a wizard or something like that. They're all very much aware of the world and have been in the world. And I think that helps with the cynicism, because up to a point, especially with someone like Akamian, it's more like world weariness than anything else. And there's a difference between cynicism and world weariness. World weariness is, for me, is cynicism, but with experience behind it.
Right. Well, I would say Xerius is much more of a cynic, or really a narcissist, actually. That's the emperor.
Oh, yeah. Well, I mean,
there's
a lot of issues with the empire there and the world building. And that's I think one of the things that really annoys me is the empire, because it is very much built. Nansur is very much built on Byzantium, or the Eastern Roman Empire, whatever you want to call it. And the way it is portrayed is very much built on, say, Edward Gibbon's portrayal in Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And the problem with that is that that's Western propaganda. The idea that all of those people are basically degenerates, continuously playing intrigue and being very, very, you know, I'm running out of words here, but like believing everything very, you know, into omens and stuff. And it's
like bird poop landing on your head.
It's borderline Orientalist, but before, you know, modern Orientalism, more like, and that stuff's been around ever since the Romans didn't actually win against certain Persian kings and had to make up propaganda to point out how they are all like really not very manly over there in the East. And he just takes all of that and takes it over into his fantasy world. Because when you look at it,
Confus is pretty manly. I mean,
is he though? He's mostly working through trickery as well.
He's clever. Yeah, he's clever. And he'll make sure the histories are written in a way that makes him manly, at least.
He's very manipulative. And I think that's part of the problem. And why that is a problem for me is that when you look at it, Bakker doesn't do a lot of world building in this book. He doesn't not really describe a lot of things. He basically just drops a few hints and lets the reader assume everything is like, yeah, you know, whatever the other town is, it's basically Rome. So I'll just imagine it to look like Rome or medieval Rome. And I'll just imagine it like I imagine Constantinople is looked before, you know, the Ottomans took it, and he just never actually describes a lot of things. You have no idea how people look. You have no idea how places look, except, of course, the other guys, the barbarians, live on the steppe, and that's it. Okay.
Yeah.
I guess I can imagine how a steppe looks, but everything else he leaves up to you. And then he drops in hints that are relying on you having a prefabricated idea of how the East looks and how the West looks. And that will be Orientalist in all kinds of ways. And I'm slightly angry that he goes that way, because he could have changed things if he wanted to.
It's interesting because there are a lot of fantasy authors who obviously do use real world history as inspiration or shorthand. If you say we as Bakker, for example, describes Kian, I'm basically picturing Arabs, Middle East, that sort of thing. He describes
although they're magic guys have saffron robes.
There's magic there too. Yeah.
And they have saffron robes, which is sort of shorthand for East Asian.
Not to mention snakes and no eyes. That was something. But yeah, you're right. I think that he does lean on the real world history, and as I said in my review, non-Sur Empire, Byzantine Empire, the Kian Middle Eastern people, there's some sort of barbaric Germanic tribes, that sort of thing. But I think he's
more like Yeah, right. You have the barbarian Germans out there they're basically Normans. They're basically Normans.
Who were basically the heart of the Crusade, actually, the Normans. So,
because they had just arrived in Sicily, and everyone tried to just use them as quickly as possible.
So what did you think of that, though, the historical foundation of the world building in here? Any thoughts on that, Jimmy or Joanna?
To comment, I would have to know about it. And I'm ignorant, so I don't know any of it. And I also don't imagine anything when I read. Like, I'm not a visual reader.
Yeah.
So like lots of that stuff just like right through my ears. So
okay. But Raf is essentially right that he really does lean on.
Oh, I'm sure. Yeah.
Yeah.
Joanna, any thoughts on that?
Nothing I could think of. I mean, I guess I didn't see it as anything that bothered me or a problem. I did notice that a lot of the descriptions, I think there were some good descriptions, honestly, that worked for me, but I didn't notice anything that pulled me out of the story, or, I'm not the biggest history buff either, so it didn't really, I don't know.
So we can counter, though, with the idea that obviously there's magic in Earwa, or whatever this place is called, and that is something that is, I think, fairly unique. Bakker's magical system in here, I thought, was pretty odd. The various schools and that sort of thing of these, what are they called, or sorcerers?
So you have the schoolmen, right? You have the Kashar, the mandate schoolmen, Scarlet Spires, and on top, I like the way the 3 Cs is set up, and like that there's these factions, and then obviously there's this Holy Land of Shima, which is kind of cool. And then on top of that, in the prologue, we get some really weird stuff, like a mentioning of non-men, which what cool is that? Stuff. And of course the consult, the consult, it's like, okay, so like there's little things. He's definitely
faces that open up and little heads on birds. There's some really funky stuff in there.
That I think that's one of the things that kind of pulls me in, is like just like the off the wall, like go for it type deal, like a bird with a bald head on. It's like, what?
I liked that. What? I liked that stuff because I
do too.
And actually, I don't know. I feel like I'm trying to think of the right words for it. In full disclosure, I am halfway through book 2 right now, or almost at the halfway point. And so that imagery is way more fresh in my head. And I have been paying attention to a lot of the imagery that he brings up in his prose, and I love it. So I don't know if it gets better in book 2. In book 1, I feel like I maybe was attending to trying to keep up with all the various factions and how these different schools work, and different these different societies. the Enrithi factions and the Mandate School and the Imperial Psych, and there's just a lot of different things a lot of details in the cultures and in the people. I think that was maybe where the focus was a little bit more in the first book. And then as I was saying before earlier, I went into this book knowing there would be a lot of patriarchy, and I wanted to be sure I was sensitive to how he was approaching that. So I did pay a lot of attention to female characters and how female characters interact in this world and that kind of thing too. So I might have just not been attending to those specific things. It's hard when your first time reading any book to attend to every single detail. And with a book like this, I feel like there's only so much I could attend to as a first time reader that I'm sure if I go back and there's a lot more that'll come out for me on a second.
We all focus on different things.
Yeah, nothing wrong with that. In fact, I want to talk about some of the stuff you just brought up, Joanna, because I think those are very important points. But to just finish up on this, I think Raf made a fair point. Shema is essentially Jerusalem. I think that's
that I did gather.
And
can we just point out how really, really dumb
it
is to call the guy Inri?
I mean, that's pretty on the nose, I think. Yeah.
I read that for the first time, like, dude, I felt insulted. I've been in so many churches. I've seen that Inri on so many bloody crucifixes at this point. I'm like, you could have been subtle, man. You could have been subtle.
And Sejanus, I don't even know how you would say it, but I mean, it basically.
The other book says Sejanus, but
it sounds like Jesus. Right?
It's an anagram. It's like,
I didn't catch that.
But you know what Inri stands for, right? I mean, I'm pretty sure you do.
Yeah, that and Shema were the things I could gather, and I knew, like, someone told me it was about the Crusade, but like I don't know enough about the Crusades to be like, oh, that's that. You know what I mean? So
yeah. But my to bring it quickly to an end, like my point was exactly that he mostly he makes the assumption that you will fill in the details. He tells you about like armor, he tells you how, dirty the camp is and stuff like that. And he's great in these descriptions, but he's like more like people are traveling on a boat. And he'll not tell you what kind of boat that is. Or like they're going to the city. He'll not tell you how the city looks. He'll just make you, the reader, do that work, which is fine. But the point is that then we will fill in that stuff with our prejudices.
Yeah, just also so everyone knows Inri, because I don't think everybody watching is going to know what that stands for. Those initials are. It's Jesus Nazarenus Rex Judeorum, which is Jesus of Nazareth, King of the Jews, right? Inri.
It's supposedly it is what the Romans, when they nailed the guy to a tree, a cross, put down so people who walked past and didn't know him could find out what he was accused of, because that's the idea. You have like your people, you crucify them, you put like a sign down at the cross, like this is the guy who was hanged put there for murder. This guy was put there for pretending to be a king of the Jews, but because they already have one, Herod the Great. And that was kind of illegal, so that's why we crucified him for. So that's where that Inri comes from.
Yeah, so that is definitely on the nose. But it's. I'd like to go back though to one of the points that Joanna talked about, and that is the portrayal of women in here. And it's not that they're unique in the sense that nobody has a lot of agency in this, right? So then it's not that he singles out women, I think.
It does though.
And they do. Okay, we'll talk about that too then. But they seem to be, because of the nature of this world, the harsh nature of this world, it's a patriarchy and it is not a nice place. There's not a ton of compassion in here. Not a lot of, like, I mean, we're all familiar with fantasy having a lot of suffering and pain and that sort of thing. And there are different ways of dealing with it. Like, for example, in First Law, Joe Abercrombie has a great sense of humor. So, somehow it makes it more tolerable. We all know Malazan. We know there's Malazan humor too. We know there's an emphasis on compassion, exploring compassion in there. There's beautiful moments of connection. There wasn't anything like that in The Darkness That Comes Before. There was no...
There's one.
Yeah.
The bird poops on the emperor.
The bird poops. The bird poop saves the day.
That was funny. Yeah. That's a good point.
I didn't find that funny.
Of course you did, Raf.
maybe my problems. I've read books on religious omens and stuff in like ancient Greek and Roman religion, and that shit's fucking serious, to put it mildly. So yeah, of course he would react like this. From our perspective, it's like, oh, look, a bird crapped on him. Isn't that funny? It's like, in that belief system, if you take that stuff seriously,
right,
that's a very rational reaction because that stuff is important.
Can it not be both?
Only if you think those people are less civilized than you, because laughing about someone being crapped on by a bird and then reacting with panic, and if you find that funny, that's because you look down on those people and think, oh, look, they're less sophisticated than me, because obviously
No,
only a bird crapped on him.
I
You know
think
what I
it
mean?
was because it's a fictional book is why I thought it was funny.
Okay, yeah, I can see that, but the humor behind it is still like, it only works if you don't believe the same thing that guy believes,
yeah.
and you think he's kind of dumb for believing it.
There are
I
characters
think-
in the story present too, though.
I mean, he's also, but hold on. So he is
Go ahead, Jimmy.
definitely set up to be an arrogant ass prior to
Yeah.
this.
100%.
Yeah.
So if you see an arrogant ass fall in a puddle in the middle of New York City, you're going to laugh. And that is what I laughed at. Not because I think people who believe a certain thing or whatever are stupid.
Yeah.
Right. Fair enough. I think that,
can-
if it had happened to any other character, we wouldn't have laughed as much. So
Yeah.
because it was serious, I think we all sort of enjoyed the moment a little more. I would agree with that, Jim.
I did get the impression that Bakker was being humorous with that character a lot, and in sort of a tragic way, because he's obviously very paranoid due to the way his mother brought him up.
But that's what I meant earlier when I said like the way he portrays those people who are very much based on Byzantium, and we don't use the word Byzantine for no reason in like our language nowadays. And that portrayal of the paranoia within the Byzantine court is something that you find in Western histories of Byzantium in a lot of cases, and that stuff is in part Western propaganda, because we had the church schism at the time, the Western Roman Empire, and then later on the German Reich, the Holy Roman Empire, and so forth. They wanted to make clear that they are the good guys, and those guys over there are degenerates who believe everything, and they're all about intrigue and stuff. And he just takes all of that and makes it part of his world. And that's what annoys me so much about it, because he basically falls for like a 1500-year-old propaganda when he just portrays Byzantium like that.
Mm-hmm. Although they're the Nansir Empire, right? So
yeah, they're the Nansir Empire, but it is very clear where he gets that stuff from.
Yeah, I agree. It is very much, and I certainly mentioned it when I did my review. So, but back to this point about the place of women in this society, in this story, and I want to make clear from the very beginning that I do not believe that R. Scott Bakker is being misogynistic by writing this book. I think that it is absolutely legitimate to explore something as horrible and serious as misogyny in fantasy, and to do so in a way that is, I hope, responsible and is sympathetic toward the people who have to suffer through it. And I think, that's a legitimate thing we can explore. But it is certainly true, I think, that with the two main female perspective characters, one is Esmenet, and she is a prostitute, referred to as a whore repeatedly, and has certainly internalized that word in terms of what it means, all the connotations which are very degrading. And then the other one is Serway, who is a concubine, which is, I guess,
same but with more class.
A little bit different, but also has been through similar trauma, and at this point is delusional, I think, in terms of what she expects and wants from Kelhus. I don't know where that relationship is going. Maybe I'm wrong, but I feel like at this point, Serway is deluding herself, and that Kelhus knows she is and is allowing that to happen for whatever reason he might have. Or maybe, does he have compassion on her? I don't know what your perspective is. What do you guys think about all that?
Well, I agree with you, Philip. I read this and I read this with, I take it on good faith that this is not Bakker's way of suggesting this is how the world should be. And I think that's the hard part for a lot of people who read fantasy, is that we want idealism in fantasy. And it actually, honestly, there were, I didn't, how do I put this? It did make me appreciate Malazan a lot more in some ways, because when I first read Malazan, I was one of those readers that I didn't really think about what he was doing with gender until people started bringing it up, and I didn't even think about it because I did notice there was patriarchy and misogyny in Malazan. But then reading this, it makes it really clear, like, but at least in the Malazan world, there are places where women can be in leadership positions or soldiers. You see women able to make certain choices. You see other paths for women. You see that they are able to use magic. There are women who are sorcerers in this school. It seems like all the schools of sorcery are for men only.
Right.
And that
I'm curious if that'll be addressed at some point. Yeah.
Yeah. I think there is a hint. This is not a spoiler, but in book 2, I did get the hint that maybe there is a place for women to have magic in the world. But I'm curious, it was just one sentence and I'm not sure yet. But I did get the impression that the best a woman can hope for in this particular world is to be a young prostitute, because Esmenet, our 31-year-old prostitute, is considered past her prime. And it's just, it really upset me because as somebody who's much older than 31, I was horrified by the fact that she's, her customers are men, priests, even, people who are not supposed to be with whores anyway. And they're with her. And there are people who have gray hair and who are clearly a bit older than her. And at the same time, there's one exchange with one customer, for example, who's kind of apologetic to her, like, I'm sorry, Esmenet, I found a younger woman. And she doesn't even take it personally. She's like, yeah, I understand. And it's just, it was sort of gutted me, the way that was set up and how there wasn't much more for her. And the same thing with Serway, it just seeing how, and also just seeing the way women hate other women, like they hate other women because they were competition for one another. I know I brought all this up in my review, but
you did, but I think it's great. And you also mentioned how Esmenet lives vicariously through the men that she encounters and wants to know about their travels and so on and so forth, which is sad in a way, but I guess that's all she's got, right?
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. This might seem like way too big of a stretch. I know it probably is, but when I was reading about Esmenet, I was almost thinking a little bit of Fantine from Les Miserables. If Fantine's child had died and then she tried to make it in the world, and but poor Esmenet, it's like, yeah, that's all she has to live for, is to sleep with other men. And she likes the men who have suffered because they have experience, and it's her way of getting that experience and that worldview. And at the same time, she plays into this game of pretending she cares about the man, and she's feeding their ego when she really doesn't care about that. And that Akamian understands that. So I did really appreciate, in some ways, I wanted to appreciate the relationship between Akamian and Esmenet, but at the same time, all the men are horrible towards women in this book, all of them.
Yeah.
Like there's not a single man that I could get behind. I wanted to like Nair because there were so many layers to Nair that I found fascinating.
Just but he's one of the worst. Yeah.
And he's horrible. He's the worst. Yeah.
But Xerius loves his mommy.
That's what I was going to ask. Like, but what about his mom, right? Like his mom, I think, is a non-concubine, non-whore, and then we see that. So I wanted to know, Joanna, how you felt about her.
But wait, who?
Xerius's mommy.
The Emperor's mom.
Oh.
The Emperor's
little Mother's Day brunch.
The worst female character in the entire lot.
Yeah.
It was scary.
But that's okay. You go ahead.
I wouldn't nominate her for Mother of the Year.
No,
but that's the point where I think the world building and the idea that this is not misogyny kind of breaks down, because she's portrayed as an absolute caricature of the shrewish, overbearing mother. And in every situation where she is portrayed, she's on the one hand trying to do the best and also at the same time failing, because clearly she's not as smart as either her grandson or her son. And once things actually get interesting in that last final confrontation, when, you know, everyone talks it out and stuff, she's suddenly no longer there. And that, I think, is a problem, because she's like the third out of three, you know, female characters in the entire book that get like more than one line to say. And she's portrayed as absolutely hateable. And that's a choice by the author.
Yeah, although two of the three are okay, they're portrayed as very much downtrodden, but sympathetic characters.
Yeah.
And it's not that this is a world where there can't be evil women as well. There are women who act horribly as well in a world that is basically built on exploitation.
Yeah, but she's acting very much as the caricature of an evil woman, in like all the stereotypes that we have for, you know, evil women. If she would, like, you know, walk around and punch people in the face for being dickheads to her, or just because she's, you know, evil or whatever, that would be interesting. But she's very much the stereotype of the screeching, you know,
old crone,
mother-in-law, mother-in-law, basically.
Yeah.
Although she's the mother, and I think that's the issue.
Although when she's up against her son, I actually kind of root for her more often than not. But Jimmy, what do you think about all this? What is your response to the place of women in the book? And
so, I think it's really interesting if you take a look at the choices for the female characters that are given, and Raf hit on something pretty important, that is the character. I can't say it today.
Caricature.
Thank you. Of a woman, not just evil woman, but in fantasy, actually. Fantasy throughout the decades has had this time and time again. And another portrayal of women that we've seen in fantasy time and time again is a whore and a concubine. And I was reading a heated debate between R. Scott Bakker and a random blogger who is accusing him of misogyny. And I went down a rabbit hole. And some of the things that he said that I thought were interesting, and I'm not saying I agree one way or the other really, but is that he wrote this with a male voice, and he wrote through the male gaze on purpose, and he did it in a way that was meant to disgust the reader. And that unfortunately there are people who read this and actually go, yeah.
Yes.
And that is not what his idea was, is to trick you with the male gaze. I shouldn't say trick, is to settle into the male gaze. Like, hey, I've seen this fantasy kind of stuff before, and then take it to a level to where maybe even someone who thinks that those things are valid starts to go, well, wait a minute. Now you went a little too far with that. Like, you probably shouldn't have done that. And he described it as a critique of men. Something is wrong with the men in this story. And this obviously comes off the back of stuff that he has studied before, but also like things that we hear about, right? Like the fact that male dolphins have a natural, what's the word I'm looking for? Natural, I don't know. Male dolphins sexually abuse female dolphins, essentially. And I think he's trying to compare men to animals in some respects. And I may be getting some of the details wrong, so please don't.
As long as he doesn't mention lobsters, I'll cut him some slack.
Well, I don't even know what that is, but I'm not
something
sure.
Other people in Canada who call themselves philosophers sometimes mention.
Whenever you're done, I want to add.
Oh no, that's fine. I'm just saying. So when I look at it like this, that makes my brain start working a little bit. All men are terrible to women in this book, without exception. A commune isn't even aware that he's terrible. Or maybe he is. Maybe he actually is to a certain degree.
A little bit, yeah.
I found Akka and Esme's relationship to be heart-wrenching and at times even gross, but also like one of the more unique relationships I've seen, at least in fantasy. So that's just some context I can add just from reading back and forth discourse over a while of people who have had, problems with the way that he portrays women.
I've heard about that conversation. If you can link me that later, I would love to read it.
Yeah,
it's very infamous, that discussion, and so forth.
He's had it multiple times. I will say.
I can see what he's trying there. I would say he fails, and the reason there is he's created this world, and he's decided to build this world in this specific way. And that's an important thing that China Miéville said when he talked about what's so great about Tolkien, when, the other part that is not the quote, and when he talks about Lord of the Rings being the when on the arse of fantasy, which he has said, where he says
Say Philip, it's all red.
It's a fantastic quote, and he makes basically the same point that Stephen Erickson makes, which is like, you can't write fantasy and no one will compare you to Lord of the Rings, which is a problem if you write something else, because people will still compare you to Lord of the Rings. But my point is, he says, like, what Tolkien brought to fantasy is not the story, but what Tolkien brought to fantasy is the idea of world building. And world building is at heart radical, because if you make your own world, you can put into that world whatever you want. You can create the world that you would love to live in, or you can create a very terrible world. It's up to you. It's your choice. And that's the problem that you need to live with. And that's, I think, where the failure with Bakker is, and probably in my view also with George R. R. Martin, but let's not go there. The point is, if you decide to have a brutal patriarchy in your world, the question is, like, why do you want that in there? Is your story very much about condemning the patriarchy and, showing how terrible sexism and misogyny is? Then you should probably make that front and center of your story. But with the way the world is built here and the way the story evolves so far in book one, it feels like people being, dudes being dicks towards women is sort of an afterthought that is just put in because that's sort of how we think medieval times were, and they were not.
I don't quite agree with that last part. I mean, everything up to there I agreed with, but the last part, perhaps, I think he's not just inserting this to be random or to be...
No, I'm not saying he's doing it. I'm just saying because he focuses on the Holy War and all these other things, it reads like an afterthought. Okay. It would be better if that is one of the points you want to make in your narrative explicitly, and you put it into your world to make that point explicitly, then you need to put it further up there when it comes to priorities in your story. Maybe. And not just like having it in the background all the time.
There's a risk of hitting the reader too hard with it too, though. But I think he is
well,
definitely...
That's your point, that you can just like, you should punch as hard as you can, if that's the point you want to make.
I think
there is I think, Joanna was going to make a point a while back. I want to make sure.
Well, I just wanted to say that what Jimmy said, that was how I read it. That was exactly the angle I was coming at from it, that he was trying to make a commentary against these things by putting it in, by focusing in. That was how I personally read it. At the same time, I can also understand how it might have gone too far for some readers, and how some readers might have, for example, I mean, not to go into graphic detail, but the parts where Esmenet is getting...
we could call it raped, I think.
Raped, yeah, by that creature.
The demon.
Yeah.
By an otherworldly magical. I mean, that was the most disturbing part of the book for me.
Yeah.
I think that's the most problematic too, because it's portrayed as her having pleasure as well. And you're like, dude, do you need to go there?
That's correct, Raf.
That's sort of the big problem. There's like, you have a demon come in, and it's a powerful demon, but instead of just magicking her to tell it everything, it goes and rapes her, and through that rape makes her feel so much pleasure that she's helpless to tell the demon everything. And I'm like, that was unnecessary, because it's not even a human. You don't have to do the whole like, there's something wrong with men, because suddenly there's something wrong with demons, and I have to put this into my book for the male readers, supposedly.
The follow-up on that is that she is used again as essentially a vessel by the other guy who's like, oh, this happened to her earlier, so I want a piece of that, or whatever.
That other guy is also a demon, right? Yeah. We know the other guy is also a demon.
A lesser servant of the demon, whatever he is. But
is he a demon?
What's his name? No,
I take him as human.
That guy. Yeah.
It's very clear. He's not human. He's not Sarcellus. The one who's posing as Sarcellus.
Well, Sarcellus is one of those.
He's not one of the face things, is he?
I'm pretty sure he's one of the face things. It's sort of, it is hinted at that he's one of those face tentacle dudes. Okay.
Like the advisor to Xerxes.
Yeah, exactly. He's the same thing. And what we don't know is if Sarcellus ever existed and was replaced by him at some point,
Yeah.
or if he just, showed up as Sarcellus and made his way through the ranks. We don't know that yet because that stuff didn't get touched upon in the book.
Okay.
But
But
I
whatever
think-
he is, he's lesser than
The other dude, yeah.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I
Sorry,
think
John?
one other thing I want to mention too about that is that I think the one thing that also broke my heart, in addition to everything we mentioned about the women, is just how anytime, like speaking regarding female agency, is anytime the two characters I'm thinking of Serway and Esmenet, they tried to take ownership of their situation. Like Esmenet tried to get away. It's like they got beaten back down. It's like any attempt towards
Mhm.
any empowerment or any sort of freedom from their situation, she ends up getting stoned. She ends up getting taken
That was the
away.
hardest part for me.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I don't know why. It just like really bothered me.
I
Yeah.
think that was actually the hardest part for me too, especially from young boys who, in my mind, I don't know if I was misinterpreting this, but I almost read it as she was almost seeing those boys almost like in a maternal way. And then
Mhm.
for them to suddenly see her as a horror and marked, and then suddenly start stoning her, it just ripped into my soul.
Yeah.
It
Yeah.
just was so
Yeah.
heartbreaking.
It
It's very
annoyed
much
me.
like another stoning in literature that everybody probably knows, the lottery, where people do it because they've been socialized to do it. These boys have been socialized to look
Yeah.
at a woman like her in this way. And it is horrible. And it is the way that these kinds of hatreds get passed on. They've learned that this is the way we treat women who have this kind of tattoo on their left hand or whatever it is. And it's
Right.
just, yeah.
And then the same thing with Serway. She tries to run away,
Yeah.
and then she gets captured, and then it's like she gets punished for trying to get away and causing everything to get worse. And the way that Kelhus just lets her get raped over and over again.
By
it's-
Nair. Yeah.
Yeah, it's like, so she tries to take ownership of her situation. She tries to run away, and then it ends up beating her back down even harder in the end. So that was what was heartbreaking for me, is just anytime the women tried to break free or tried to get some power in their situations, it
Yeah.
just turned out worse for them than it was to begin with.
It's true of the men too, but it doesn't happen to the men in a sexual way.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem there. It's like,
Right.
if this is war, to be fair, sexual violence has been used in war, but it is used as a tool of dominance. And that means that you very much use it to also, destroy anyone else's sense of masculinity and power. So where are all those pseudo-medieval fantasies where dudes get raped all the time? Apparently they don't exist outside of, Land Fit for Heroes, but
It's coming.
Oh, dear.
you're right.
Yeah, yeah, I'm
It's-
sure. I'm sure it is. I'm sure it is. I mean, everyone does get it hard in this world and in this story,
Yeah.
for sure. But
I
it was just something that I
Mm.
I definitely noticed. And anyway, I have another idea I wanted to bring up really quickly.
Oh, please do.
That's not related to this. I was curious. Did anybody notice there was something? I mean, maybe this wasn't intentional on Baker's part, but there was something about a connection between fathers that was happening in the story. So, for example, with Kelhus having his father's voice and going after his father, and then there was some
Nair.
backstory about Nair and his father, and then Kelhus was manipulating Serway with the voice or language of her father. And so I was kind of noticing this common thing happening, and I just was curious if anybody else noticed that.
Would you say that could be a part of the darkness that comes before?
Possibly.
Well, I mean, in principle, yes, right? I mean,
Yeah.
Because we pass our genes on to the next
Mhm.
generation. We pass our trauma on to the next generation. We pass our social values on to the next generation. And that is what determines what they're not just what there happens to them, but the very way they look at the universe. So
Although, to be fair, the interesting thing is that at least with Kelhus, if we assume that Kelhus's goal is actually to go and kill his father and not just do something else, and he's telling the "I'm gonna kill my father" story to everyone just to be, a manipulative dickhead, which he is. Then the interesting thing is that all these like father-son at least father-son situations. And I guess we can almost add Canthus and whatever the emperor's name is.
His uncle, yeah, Xerius.
Yep.
Oh, yeah,
Sirius. Yeah, we can almost take that one as well. Those are very much rivalries. You know,
Yeah.
Kelhus is out to get his father. Technically, Nair killed his father by using or being used by Kelhus's father.
Yeah.
Canthus and Xerius are constantly struggling about like authority father. There's very much a father-son rivalry situation going on there, if not a rebellion, outright rebellion. That's, I think, interesting here.
Nature red in tooth and claw, right? I mean, it's,
yeah, you can. I guess you can say it, take it that way. I think what annoyed me so much about the whole patriarchy thing is that it is very much sort of the assumed standard in a lot of fantasy worlds that are unfortunately called realistic so often. Game of Thrones is like obviously the example that always gets pulled up because George R. R. Martin has said like, yeah, I try to portray it realistic, which is wrong. But when you look at medieval times, those like very misogyny was there, don't get me wrong, and rigid gender roles were certainly there, but up to a point they were the privilege of the upper classes. Like peasants and so forth did have a far less rigid gender structure because you know, you needed everyone to do whatever had to be done. The idea of being married off and having as many children as possible is very much the privilege of the upper classes in medieval Europe for a long time. But we just assume that everyone is just always behaving like assholes towards women and that's more like that's a much later development, but we just take that over in so many like fantasy worlds that pretend to be pseudo medieval Europe. And it kind of annoys me because if you make your own world, you need to explain that. You need to have a reason why you put that into your world. And I can see Bakker trying to make a point about men being, you know, assholes. I get that. I would argue that he should have, you know, made it a bit clearer because it is very easy to ignore that. On the other hand, he's right to be pissed if people go like, yeah, fuck yeah, let's go. That's not how you should read that. And if you do that, then there's something very wrong with you.
Very wrong.
yeah. And obviously there is that problem because there are people out there that are like that. But the point for me is, if you're just having this in there and then you're talking about religion and weird demons that hide behind the powers that be and all of that stuff. Oh, and also women are treated like crap. Then you can't complain if people don't pick up on you making this a deliberate choice. It feels very much like, oh, I just wanted to have it feel like dark and medieval because it just happens on the side. That was my point.
I feel like what he's exploring here is agency or lack thereof. And maybe what he's trying to say is this is what happens in a world that lacks agency. The default becomes the exploitation of the weak by the powerful in every which way, shape, or form, including misogyny. So he is portraying a lack of agency and the consequences in a pseudo historical society that somewhat resembles, you know, the age of the First Crusade. But I feel like he is very invested in exploring this, and I'm curious.
Isn't that really fucked? Because what he's saying there is like, if there is no free will, if there is predetermination because of our biology, what will happen is that dudes will treat women like crap, and that's just our nature.
Well,
because
then maybe
if that is the absolute like underlying thing, because there is no free will in his world,
right,
then you need to see what I mean.
But we go back to,
you can't do both.
So this is where I go back though to his statement about he's very wary of certainty, and to say outright there is no free will, that sounds like certainty to me. So
yeah,
I'm wondering now. I haven't read the rest of the series, so I don't know yet. Jimmy knows, and he's keeping a good poker face there. But I am wondering where he goes with this, and I am hoping. I said it in my review. I would love to see, particularly the women, have some kind of agency in this or other, but I don't know if he goes there or not. If honestly, at the end of the trilogy, the Prince of Nothing, it looks like there is no agency and it's what you were just describing, Raf, which sounds horrible to me, then I might not continue with the series. I really might not, even as much as I admire his writing, and he's brilliant in so many ways. And this is worth exploring to me, at least in the trilogy, but I don't know if I want to live in a world with zero free will at all. And then the result of that is this horrible world where everybody is cruel to each other and the most powerful exploit the weaker. So I don't know. I don't want to continue to live in that world, I think. So what about you guys? What about you, Joanna?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. This is why I'll never be able to give this a universal recommend. I just can't.
Mhm.
Hard to recommend.
I just can't. And that's the hard thing. And I mean, I think that's part of booktube culture, is like, if I love a book and then people ask you, Joanna, recommend me one of your favorite books, I'm like, I can't recommend this. I really enjoyed it. Like, I couldn't stay away from it. I kept feeling, I'm already almost halfway through the second book. Like I said, there's something about his writing and what he's doing that is drawing me in. But I can understand this is not a world I'd ever want to live in. And this is not exactly what people want to read fantasy for necessarily. And I guess it just depends on what people want to read fantasy for.
Yep.
And I think, okay, this kind of goes back to the discussion we had with Stephen Erickson a little bit. And I don't know if so Jimmy and Philip and I were in a discussion with Stephen Erickson on Steve Talks Books channel.
Uh-huh.
And I brought up in that discussion how a week before Steve had Janie Wirtz on his channel, and how she explained that for her personally, she didn't believe in writing grimdark. She wanted to explore human nature and look at the darkness in human nature, but she felt it was important in her books to land in a place of hope, that she feels like that's an important thing. Actually, I talked to my mom on the phone last night about this series and this author, and she was in so much in agreement with Janie Wirtz about this. We had a long talk about this, actually. And then a week later, when we were in that discussion with Stephen Erickson, I brought that idea up to Stephen Erickson, and he said, I agree with Janie. And to me, that was personally very inspiring to me, because I consider both Janie Wirtz and Stephen Erickson authors who do look at the darkness in human nature. They are willing to look that deep in the eye, take an honest look, and go there. And at the same time, for them to say they believe in arriving at a place of hope, for some, it was meaningful to me, especially knowing that these two authors have also lived a lot. They've had real life experiences too, outside of their writing. But I think the reason why arriving in a place of hope for me is something I find personally important as a reader, or what I want to find in books, is because I feel like if we end in a place of hopelessness, it's a dead end. It's like, there's that saying, hope rings eternal. And there's that idea, even in Tolkien, the road goes ever on and on. That even with, and I love how Tolkien, I know a lot of people criticize Tolkien these days who are all about grimdark, but the idea, I think that they have a lot of the discussion I hear about Tolkien is such a misunderstanding of what he was doing with the fantasy genre. And he did not deny grief and sadness in his fantasy. He had a place for that. And so I think that actually adds to the richness of the beauty and the hope that we arrive at. And so for me, the idea of hope, it rings eternal, or the road goes ever on and on, is that if we land in a place of hope, there's always going to be an echo of openness to something more expansive. Whereas I feel like arriving in a place of hopelessness is like it just sucks you into an endpoint. I guess that's how I see it. And that's just where my evolving thoughts are right now. I don't know if that answers your question, Philip.
I think beautifully, actually. And the fact is, I think you're hitting on the heart of the matter, which is the purpose, or purposes, I should say, of storytelling, really. Why do we tell stories? And in some way, shape, or form, it can be to grapple with things like the idea of whether or not we have free will. But it also could be, one answer is to give us a sense of belonging in the world, or a sense of hope, a sense of empowerment, kind of like what Stephen Donaldson talked about when he talked about fantasy as the literature of reintegration, that it gives you a sense of empowerment, that you're not absurd and helpless, that you can act in the world and craft meaning and purpose for yourself and that sort of thing. So I think that Bakker's kind of on the other side, which I think there's a place for that exploration too. I really want to affirm that.
Yes.
I believe that there is a place for the type of exploration that I feel that Bakker is doing very skillfully. It's not a place I want to dwell in a lot. You could call me, you could say that I'm deluding myself when I say that I prefer, like you, stories that I do want to see them engaged with suffering and pain in the world, but I want some kind of reflection of hope in there as well, and that I feel I can emerge from this story with a bit of a sense of purpose. And I don't know where Bakker's going yet because I've only read the first book, so I don't want to judge. But
yes, and just to echo what you were saying, and that's also where I feel like I'm suspending my judgment about anything right now, because at the same time as that's kind of where I'm at, I described to you where I'm at with hope and hopelessness. I also appreciate books like this. I appreciate books that challenge me. And maybe I'll arrive at a totally different place when I'm finished with it. I just don't know. Yeah. I do appreciate that it has its place and that we can explore it in literature. And that's a nice thing. It's a book. So it does give us some like psychic distance, as you're always saying, right?
Yes. Yeah. And if Bakker's purpose was to challenge, he's done a brilliant job. Look at this discussion.
Yeah.
Jimmy, any thoughts on all that, on the hope or lack thereof, or the place of a story like this, which let's just say there is no hope in series. It has a place though, doesn't it?
Jimmy loves Cormac McCarthy.
Yeah, I would say I am very not like you two, I guess. Like I'm sitting here like I'm the worst, I guess. I don't need to have any hope in a story. I don't need to leave it with any hope. Maybe I feel very hopeless. Maybe that's why. Maybe it's more of a reflection of me, probably. And I'm willing to embrace that. I don't know how deep I want to go because this is a very deep question.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
No, I'm not going to. No, I just don't. I don't think a story has to, and I don't think that you're saying it has to. You're just saying that your preference for that. Yeah. I tend to go with a story that resonates me, and whether that leaves me with an open end or it leaves me with a closed door, that's simply the lottery of reading a book to me, and that is totally fine. I've read things like Raf just said, like Cormac McCarthy, Child of God is horrendous. Left me absolutely zero hope, made me actually disdain humanity a bit, to be honest with you, especially with the injustice of it all. But I felt like it was well worth exploring. So that's just kind of where I arrive. As far as this series goes, I don't know if you're going to find a ton of hope. I also don't think that everything that you're wanting to pays off in the trilogy, even though I do think that there are really some really good endpoints that open the door to new things. It's like everything. It's like, I think the full context requires the sequels, but not everyone's going to do that. So it is what it is. And, it's a trilogy and then 4-book series. So like they are 2 different arcs in a way. I look at this trilogy a lot like the prologue. And if there's a trilogy about doubt, then that would make you probably, without, leading you, I would assume that you would assume that the next 4 books are about belief. So there's a lot of changes in the world, and a lot of the stuff when it comes to patriarchy and women actually comes in the sequels. I'm not saying it gets any better for women in this book. And I'm also, I'm the one who's giving the context of what Bakker's arguments are. I don't want people to misinterpret that as me being like, this is perfect execution of these themes. I am not saying that in any way, shape, or form. I actually don't even think I'm qualified to critique it because I don't know enough. But I'm just simply stating that for the people who are watching this and maybe have questions or have read it and felt a certain type of way. That was the intent, and whether he executed well or not is, up to whoever. But I think the series will never give you a definitive answer. Philip, you were kind of saying like, if there is no agency, then I don't know if I could live here. But I don't think the intent of this series is to give you an answer to that question.
Mhm.
I felt at the
Sure.
end of this, and this is all 7 books, I felt as conflicted as I do every single day when I wake up.
Okay. Huh. Which is okay, actually. Again, he's not all about certainty here, is he? So
Well, I think there could be an openness to that too, so
Maybe.
maybe, I don't know. Well, I can say that I mean, it's enjoy just always feels like the wrong word for this series.
Yeah.
I'm enjoying it so far.
happy reading.
I think the question is like, did you regret reading it?
No
No.
way.
No, not a single page.
Then it was worth reading. And that's,
Mm.
I mean, I think that sounds better than enjoyment, because enjoyment means like, oh, I had so much fun reading this. Like, no, but I was engaged while doing so. It left me thinking about stuff. I do not regret it. I don't think I have wasted my time. Then it was good. I mean, it's that simple sometimes. And I know I've been like very harsh on it today. I just wanted to point out there was one scene fairly near the end that just shows how good Bakker can be when he wants to. When we have that like whole argument at that final disputation, and we switch to Kelhus' perspective, and we flash back in time between reality and like the past, where he goes through his like ordeal,
Training.
where he has to sort of go through that, like find the darkness that comes, that part. And just the way he was structured and how he jumps back and forth between like his perceptions in the now and the way he is losing, internalizing that mantra and stuff like that in the past, that was just executed extremely well. Just like from like a sheer craft point of view, that was just like done extremely well.
Agreed.
Did you guys feel like that was like the Council of Elrond moment of this book? Because Bakker definitely takes a lot of inspiration from Dune, Lord of the Rings, and Cormac McCarthy. Those are like his 3 he quotes a lot.
Huh.
I'm not sure if it's the Council of Elrond moment, because Council of Elrond moment is sort of where we have in Lord of the Rings. Council of Elrond is when we actually have the idea, when everyone's like, this is how the rest of the novel will be. We have a goal, which is like someone has to go there and do that thing. We still don't know what the actual goal of any of this is. Yes, the Holy One wants to go and, free Jerusalem and wade through like ankle deep blood of Christians and anything else we can slaughter on the way. I get that. But what's Kelhus's goal? We don't know. He says he wants to kill his father. But we also know that he says whatever gets him like further on. So do we know? So I don't think we have had a Council of Elrond moment, because we don't have a roadmap for the rest of it. And Lord of the Rings is like very unique that like halfway through the first novel, we get a roadmap. Like these are the goals. And now we'll find out whether we achieve them or not. We don't know what the goals are yet. It is certainly a very powerful moment. It's really well executed. And I do appreciate that. I do see the whole like when you said Dune, the whole like dreams thing of the schoolman, that feels very drink the water of life kind of thing to
Very
me.
much.
Yeah. So when we're talking about the Council of Elrond part, is this the same part when Nair is basically making Compass tearing down Compass's argument and asserting himself as leader or whatever with Proyas's?
But he's not. He's sort of winning, but Kelhus takes over. That's the point.
I see. Okay.
It's Kelhus saying like, I'll go to Shaimar, although I do not know the way. And then Nair is like, you have my broadsword and all my scars.
See, that's where I was like, oh, this reminds me a little bit of Council Elrond. Yeah.
I love that whole entire part though. that whole entire part of the book was incredible. I was curious though with Nair's argument. I thought it was pretty interesting the way they were projecting onto Nair this idea of vengeance and just their own ways of seeing the world on his worldview. And he was arguing that's not the way I see things. You imagine that I see things the way you see things. Right. And at the same time, I also wonder if he's kind of lying the whole time, because I mean, his whole objective isn't really war as he makes it out to be in that discussion. His objective is to find Kelhus's father.
I think
that's all he has left.
Yeah,
that's all he has left. Yeah, although I think he's sincere when he says in his own way. You guys are looking at me through your social lens, and that is
Yeah.
not how I operate. Okay, I believe him in that moment, but
I think there's a
he,
problem though, because it makes it look like that's a bad way to do things, but that's how human interaction works. We we assume that everyone operates the way we operate. That's just like how you do interaction, because
Yeah.
you don't know otherwise. And him just going like, hey, you can't assume that I will, feel for people of my, social group, so to speak, is sort of, those were fair assumptions by the Ikuri in that situation. Ikuri? Yeah, Ikuri. Those guys.
Inquiry, I think.
Ikuri, yeah, the
I said
Nansir Empire made a fair assumption there.
Yeah.
He's just a very unique horse riding snowflake there.
So I think we've covered a lot. Obviously, there's even more to this book. It is a very rich, very, I think, conducive to a lot of conversation, I'm sure. But I know that some of us have to go places. So we're going to, I think, wrap it up fairly soon. I'll be asking each of you, though, for your final thoughts to just give this a finish. So let's start where we began with Jimmy.
I'm glad y'all read it. Even people, maybe don't enjoy it as if we're getting away from enjoy, right? people pull different things and everything else from this and have things to say. I just like hearing about this series. I think it has a lot of broader ideas that I don't necessarily have the best mind for. So hearing other people bring a perspective to it that I don't have always helps me look at the work in a different light, and I appreciate it quite much. So thank you guys very much for this, and I'm excited to see what people think about book 2. If I could leave you with one question, it would be, did you feel like Naor and Kelhus interacted differently than Kelhus and everyone else? And you don't have to answer that now, but it's something to keep in mind. Because that was one of the things I have in my notes. I pulled up my notes when I read this. I read this like over a year ago. And I said, Kelhus doesn't interact with Naor the same way he interacts with everyone else.
Well, because Naor is better at resisting his manipulation.
But why?
I think there's one reason there, which is the only time we have Kelhus's perspective on another character that he's interacting with outside of Survey is with, what's his name, Naor. Could he interact with, say, a Camion differently? Probably, but we don't know because we only have a Camion's perspective so far.
So it's definitely something to keep in mind, and it's very cool.
All right, cool. Thank you, Jimmy. That's cool. Yeah, I mean, he was forewarned in a way by interacting with Kelhus's father. So that definitely is a factor in how Kelhus relates to Naor, who I think it's fair to say that Kelhus finds a challenge in Naor that he doesn't in anyone else. So
yeah.
That's how I interpreted it.
Is Naor Stilgar and Kelhus is Paul?
Maybe so. Who knows, right? There's a lot of parallels.
Yes,
I'll tell you that.
there is. It was hard not to think of Dune in a lot of ways. Yeah.
Final thoughts, Joanna?
I really getting away from the word enjoy. So hard. I was so fascinated with this book.
There we go.
So fascinated with it. I'm so glad I read it. I don't universally recommend it for all the reasons I mentioned, but I'm so glad I read it, and I'm already thoroughly fascinated by book 2 so far. So I mean, and I'm grateful for this discussion. Thank you so much, Philip, for having me, and thank you, Jimmy and Raf. I enjoy hearing your insights so much, and criticisms, Raf. That's awesome that you're sharing your philosophical knowledge and historical knowledge here.
Cool. Raf, how about you? Final thoughts?
I will say I enjoyed it because I personally enjoy arguing with authors. Even if it's only in my head, because I'm not, actually talking to them. That's part of the enjoyment. It's like I read this, I get annoyed, but I can, verbalize my annoyance and possibly take something out of it for, my general view of the world. And this book definitely delivered that. Plus, someone who actually, you know, as I said, uses a lot of fancy words that I already know, so I can feel smart. And feeling smart is something that I like.
We all like to feel like that way. Sometimes we might be deluding ourselves in that respect as well, but you know.
Well,
I always
I'm
feel
not saying I'm
dumb.
smart. It made me feel smart because I already knew those words, and I'm like,
See-
Right.
yes.
See, I had the opposite. Every time I read Bakker, I feel really dumb.
Well, Jimmy, I don't know why that is, because you're very articulate when you talk about
You are very articulate,
I have a
Jimmy.
lot
Yeah.
of CTE.
and you're one of the major reasons I'm reading these books. So,
Same
That
here.
makes me happy.
Same here.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So thank you all three of you. Actually, this has been really cool. I have enjoyed this discussion immensely. You have opened up this book even further, and I feel like there's just so much to discuss here. And this is to be continued. We are committed to reading the trilogy at least. And Jimmy might have me reading the entire thing now after what he said. We are going to continue reading the trilogy at least, and to have further discussions as a group on the Prince of Nothing. Maybe it'll even spill over into Second Apocalypse as a whole. So we shall see if we'll arrive at the Second Apocalypse or not. All right,
So
everyone.
brutal.
Thank you very much, all of you watching, and until next time.